How's it going, guys? Joe Tino here. Hope everyone's doing well. I wanted to do a walkthrough video of my new trailer track. It's kind of an epic orchestral track that was just recently accepted by one of my library partners and will be featured on a trailer track album coming up in the near future. So the track is called Prepare for Battle. We'll take a listen to it, and then I'll walk you guys through the sample libraries I used, my kind of general compositional approach, and some of the plugins I used to mix and master it. So I hope you enjoy. Cool, so that was my new track, Prepare for Battle. So let's walk through the track. So as with most trailer tracks, this entire piece started out as a really simple chord progression. I knew I wanted to do something kind of dark, so I chose G minor as my scale, which just has such an amazing moody sound to it. And so the chord progression is an 8-bar chord progression that kind of just plays out throughout the entirety of the piece, and I'm switching around what instruments are taking on the chords. But to make the intro a little bit more dramatic, moodier, we're using this giant piano from Native Instruments, and the chord progression is simple. It's just G minor, B flat major, E flat major, C minor, then E flat again, D minor, E flat again, and then F. And to make it even more dramatic, I'm doing mainly fifths, so just the piano itself sounds like really simple. And then it repeats out. And as I said, I'm using this giant piano from Native Instruments, and I have the XXL button on it, which just kind of makes it larger than life. And I am doing some post-processing, some FabFilter EQ just to cut off some of the muddiness, and using the Slate Virtual Mix Rack to hit it with a compressor and make it a little bit brighter. And then as far as send and return plugins, I'm doing some plate reverb via another Slate plugin. Comes with the Stephen Slate bundle. I'm doing some chorus, just using the kilohertz. Again, something that comes with the Slate bundle. And then Space Designer, which this is kind of my main reverb that I have on almost all the orchestral elements of the mix. And that's basically my piano sound. And then the second thing I added was this drone, which this drone comes from Lunaris, which is actually a contact library. Next up, I decided to layer this chord progression with some long strings, and most of the strings in this piece are from Cinematic Studio Strings, which is by far my favorite string library, especially for like expressive writing like this. So I'm using the bass and cello legato here, and I am doing a little bit of negative MIDI delay just to make sure that each note kind of hits on the beat. I actually programmed this stuff in and then used the delay on the inspector in Logic to pull the notes back, and then consolidated everything in place so it actually moves the MIDI notes physically behind the grid. And together, these are just outlining the chords, playing the roots. I have them playing in octaves. Super easy. If we open up the MIDI, I am doing some mod wheel expression down here just to make the strings a little bit more realistic. Other than that, in the intro, there's another pad down here from Analog Strings. Kind of a belly, airy pad. And you can see that as we move forward, I'm adding more voices to it to make the track build and build. So if I get all the way over here, just making it more harmonically dense. As far as sound effects are concerned, most of the audio sound effects in this cue are from Ava Instinct, which is both a Kontakt library and a wave sample library. And I'm using both. I like to use the audio files when I'm trying to line stuff up, and I'll use the Kontakt MIDI instance, as you can see down here, when I'm layering this with the rest of my percussion. So here's what this whoosh bang sounds like. And I'm layering that with a sub hit. This sub is not from Ava Instinct. I believe this sub is from Gravity. I think I did some premixing on it and then just bounced it out as an audio file. And you can see that I'm repeating that sub hit every 2 bars to emphasize the downbeats on the main chord progression. And so this gives the editor more options if they wanted to cut the track in somewhere that wasn't the beginning. They just have downbeats that's a little bit easier to mark up. So all in all, the intro sounds like. As we progress here, starting to get to the end of that chord progression, I start to bring in my first ostinato, which I bring in the first violins. And again, we're using Cinematic Studio Strings on the staccato setting. Actually, we might even have spiccato. Yep, so I'm on spiccato. And I'm just doing some simple ostinato patterns, and then layering up with some cellos. I'll talk more about my string processing when we get to this busier section down here. I understand that I'm doing some cello line here, a cello line here, and a cello line here. So it's not necessarily the most realistic, just in terms of having, 2 cello sections, but it's trailer music. I wanted it to sound bigger more than anything else. So in this next section here, the second iteration of the chord progression, that's where I also start to introduce the brass. And the brass is primarily composed in this piece of French horns, bass trombones, and some low brass. And for French horns, I find that CineBrass is by far the most realistic and the most expressive sounding French horns, especially the 12-horn ensemble, which just sounds larger than life. So here is the 12-horn ensemble. Just really big, really biting sound. I am doing a little bit of OTT, which is a free multi-band compressor, and this is to make it a little bit more aggressive sounding, bring out kind of the brassiness a bit more. I'm also adding in some bass trombones, and these bass trombones are, I believe, from Metropolis Arc. Yep, Metropolis Arc. When I was studying orchestration, one of the things you learn about brass is that it works well in really close harmony. So I'm able to do these closely voiced chords here, where I'm not playing entire triads because this is already an A3 bass trombone piece, which is a lot of bass trombones to begin with. But I'm able to get away with that sound because I'm not using any regular trombones or tubas. And then I am layering these with the Horde. And the Horde is a patch from Trailer Brass, which isn't the most realistic sound, but when you layer it with real brass samples, it just adds quite a bit of like girth to the low. So this is adding quite a bit of weight to the bottom end of the mix. And then to reinforce those sub-frequencies even more, I'm adding some sub-bass, which is nothing more than Logic's EXS24 with nothing loaded in it. So it's basically just a blank sine wave, and I'm doing just really low sub-bass, just cutting off any harmonics that might be in the higher frequency range. And so that's my simple brass part. The brass gets a little bit busier as the piece moves on, but again, mainly French horns, bass trombones, and that low Horde brass to reinforce some of the body. I'm also adding in this riser from Heaviosity's Gravity, which I'm just simply automating in, but it's just an 8-bar, which just builds and builds and builds and builds, and kind of leads and transitions us into the first break here. Take a listen to the full thing. Most of the Heaviosity sounds are so good already that there's no further processing on them other than just like setting them into the mix level wise. But again, this is from Gravity. This I believe is just from the 30-second riser. Yep, the 30-second riser menu. And then I'm starting to introduce some percussion ideas here. These are just cymbal rolls. So I've got a cymbal roll up here and then kind of a low drum roll down here. These top cymbal rolls are from SAGA trailer percussion, and the bottom are from Majestica, which I'm using Majestica rolls a couple different points, again, to kind of transition me from one section to another. And then I am adding a new electronic bass pulse, which this is from 8Do's Need. Really simple bass pulse. A lot of contact libraries, Omnisphere, Zebra, will have bass pulses like this. I just stumbled across this one, and it just fit in the mix really perfectly. So I could have probably used something like Evolve or Omnisphere, but this one worked for this particular track. And then that's it for this first half. We'll take a listen. Here comes that Gravity riser. And then our first break, a little bit of a longer roll. Into the first climax. And so for this first climax, I knew I wanted to take the piano out, and so I switched the chord progression to the string section, which is kind of carrying along the same chord progression, but instead of playing it longer, we're doing all short notes in kind of an ostinato fashion. So here's what my string section sounds like. Here comes a higher octave. So it's that same 8-bar chord progression, but again, we're using short strings to transition and because we've taken out the piano. So I wanted to talk a little bit about processing these strings and kind of my approach on this. I know there are a lot of ways to do this. I've always felt like I've gotten a more realistic sound actually using Logic's direction mixer as opposed to using the panner that is on the individual tracks, the actual channel strips. And the reason being is most of these samples are recorded and mixed and added in stereo. And so from my understanding is in the way that Logic's panner works is if you pan something to the left side, it's really just lowering the volume of the signal on the right side. So to keep the integrity of the stereo signal, I instead use a direction mixer, which allows me to angle the sound to one direction, but doesn't impede the fact that the sound is stereo. I'm doing a little bit of reduction on the spread just to make things feel like they're coming from a point, but you can kind of see that I'm panning this in the same way that it would if I was sitting in front of an orchestra. So my violin 1s are panned to the left, violin 2s are also slightly to the left, violas are closer to the center, and then cello and low strings basses towards the right, and that gives me a really wide stereo image with my strings. The only set of strings that are not from Cinematic Studio Strings are these low strings here, which are from Metropolis Arc 1. And so we've got a lot of doubling in octaves going on to fill out our frequency range. I am also doubling up the violin 1s an octave higher on the second half of the chord progression, which again, not the most realistic, but made the track feel much bigger and wider, which is what I was going for. I'm not doing any more low string work, so all the strings have switched to a shorter articulation, and I've always preferred using separate tracks for my different articulations as opposed to using key switches. There are pros and cons to both, but in this case, I wanted to mix the short strings differently than I mixed the long strings. The other thing, mixing-wise, I found that when I'm working with low strings, especially the Metropolis Arc 1 strings, which are pretty easy, is I'll do a little bit of multiband compression on the low frequencies here, just to control them, to tame them a bit. Otherwise, they get a little bit too unruly and kind of take over the mix. Other than that, I am doing some OTT on certain tracks and lots of subtractive EQ to get rid of any unnecessary frequencies. As far as the brass in this section, we are bringing in the Horde instrument, which is again providing us with some low filling out another root note of each chord. And then because the 12-horn ensemble is taking care of the melody, I've also brought in the 6-horn ensemble, also from CineBrass, which are playing octaves to reinforce the chords. So without the melody, and then my 12-horn ensemble is actually playing the main. And I'm kind of leaving that melody unresolved, which adds a little bit more tension, and then we will resolve it in the next section, the next big climax, where the piece starts to come to an end. So all in all, here's what my brass bus sounds like. Using, again, mod wheel automation just to make things sound a little bit more realistic. And then sound effects are all the same as they were in the first bit. I'm not changing any of the sounds. They're all Ava Instinct and those sub-hits. In this next section, I also start to add in a little bit more percussion as well. So you can kind of see my percussion is this light blue section here. With percussion, I like to throw all the rules out the window, and I don't necessarily worry as much about using instruments that are in the same library or recorded in the same room. I find with percussion, we can kind of just layer up as many different sounds as we want, and it generally most of these libraries generally blend pretty well together. So I'm doing Damage. I'm using the Armageddon hit from Damage. which is a classic. I also have 2 instances of Strikeforce, which is an amazing Kontakt library with lots of overly processed sounding drums. They're not the most realistic sounding, but when you blend them with other types of instruments, it adds quite a bit of punch. And then I've got the 8-Dio Epic Toms and the 8-Dio Epic Taikos, which are also being layered in. And then to reinforce some of the higher frequencies, I'm also layering in some cymbals from. And so together with the strings, the percussion and the strings are really the driving force behind this section of the song. So together with the strings, we have a pretty full sound. And I found when you're trying to build this really big wall of sound, it's important to take into account frequency range and how each instrument needs to fit into its own frequency range, and not layering up too many instruments that are in the same frequency range. So a lot of these cymbals here, while they might not necessarily be heard in the forefront of the mix, they add a little bit of top end to the mix that other instruments aren't capable of producing. Same thing for the low end. You know, these big taikos are probably the lowest frequency percussion have. So I'm not playing any fast rhythms with it, and I'm instead giving the fast rhythms to these other instruments that are capable of playing a little bit quicker without getting too muddy. And then again, using lots of subtractive EQ to get rid of some of the muddiness, as well as cut out any unnecessary room noise or low frequencies from the sound that would get in the way of my sub bass and some of the lower instruments. As far as electronics, I am adding a zebra pulse from the Zebra Hans Zimmer, which on its own kind of sounds cheesy, but it works when you put it in context of the mix. And then I'm also adding an Omnisphere pluck, which again, on its own, maybe doesn't sound the greatest, but when you put it in the mix, it adds a little bit of depth. A lot of the layering of these electronic elements were very much like ear candy for me. More fun to kind of blend them in with orchestral elements than them being like at the forefront of the mix. And that is basically this first little climax part. So the strings and the percussion are the primary, the driving force. The horns are taking the melody and reinforcing the chords. The electronics are kind of acting as ear candy. And then the sound effects are giving me my sync points, my hit points, allowing an editor to edit in and out of a section like this really simply. So here's my first. In this next section here, I knew I wanted to use some sort of downer, and I found this really great sample from, again, Ava Instant, which I'm just doing some basic fade-out automation here to make sure that it fades out as this riser fades in, so they're kind of like cross-fading into each other. And those are the sound effects that are triggering and transitioning from one section to the other. As far as percussion is concerned, for this section, I'm actually not changing any of the instruments. I'm using all of the same percussion instruments that we used in the last section. The only difference is I'm layering in some of these Ava Instinct hits, which are the same company that makes the wave files here, but just in the Kontakt format. And I find that when layering it with other MIDI instruments, it's just a little bit easier to program it this way. So on their own, they don't sound great, but when you layer it with the rest of the percussion, it adds quite a bit of punch, a little bit more of an aggressive transient, I guess. And then brass, all the same. Here comes the main melody. So even though most trailer music isn't very thematic in terms of the melody, there was some sort of theme I had here, da-na-na-na-na, and I knew I wanted to layer that with a couple of different instruments just to remix it. Just to make that part a little bit more powerful. And so I ended up finding an Omnisphere lead, which reminded me very much of these. It had a very kind of cheesy 80s sound, but for whatever reason, when you mixed it with the French horns, it gave me a little bit more stereo width, which helped the melody poke the mix. So again, it's one of those things where you don't necessarily notice it all that much, but it's adding just a little bit of extra ear candy to the sides of the mix. And then I'm also layering that melody with a children's choir. Just to give it a little bit of air on the top end. Again, not necessarily something you hear in the mix, but I find that especially on this last, it gives it a little bit more of an airy sound towards the end. Speaking of choirs, we are also bringing in our short and long choirs here. And our short choirs are from Oceania, and they sound like this. So reinforcing the main ostinato pattern as well as the percussion. I don't believe there's a way to select the phrases in this library, at least the patch that I have selected. And so I actually think that the randomization worked pretty well, where I wasn't necessarily going for any particular phrase. I just wanted choir in there because it sounds epic. The long notes are kind of just reinforcing the chord progression again, kind of playing with the legato strings we're playing in the beginning. And I am using Metropolis Arc 1 for both the men's and women's choir. And the children's choir is, I believe, from Metropolis Arc 2. Yep, Metropolis Arc 2. And so together, all my choirs sound like this. And I found that the combination of these libraries just really blended well with the rest of the track. Again, strings almost copied and pasted from this section right here. It's really then the brass that kind of grows harmonically and builds, makes the rest of this piece sound a little bit larger. Take a listen. And then this very outro part I added kind of just as an alternate ending, where if the editor wanted a couple more options as far as ending the piece of music, they've got some options in here where they can cut stuff in and fade stuff out really easily. So I'm transitioning using the same. So instead of doing the main chord progression, which is dun, 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 I'm doing dun, 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 dun. So just to kind of change up the rhythm a little bit, give it a slightly different feel, make it feel more like an ending. All of the instruments are exactly the same, just the actual MIDI information is different because it's a new part. The only new addition is instead of doing the long bass trombones, which I had been doing for the rest of the cue, I added in the short trombones, which I believe are also from Metropolis Arc 1. So very kind of bitey, aggressive sound, and then I'm doing more OTT just to reinforce that a bit. Otherwise, looks like all of the other instruments are exactly the same, and I'm kind of ending it with the horde, which was kind of like my big Brahmsy sound. I didn't want to use kind of a traditional Brahms sample, but this worked because it was a timbre that was already in the piece of music earlier on, so people were familiar with it, and so it kind of just brings everything to an end. And I'm also adding in a riser from Rise and Hit, which is a Native Instruments. And I believe that this was a sample, a preset that I tweaked, made the rise time a little bit longer to match the length of. And those are kind of my sound effects towards the end. Yeah, so that was my track. The only extra thing that I did, which wasn't something I delivered to the library, typically when I deliver to libraries, I am giving them unmastered versions because they're going to master my track in context with all of the other artists who are also providing information, also providing tracks for the album. But I added a mastering chain for my own sake, and this is a pretty standard mastering chain of mine, which I'm more than happy to go through in a separate video if anyone would like to see. But I'm doing a little bit of Universal Audio tape plugin just to add a little bit of warmth, a little bit of character, and it kind of acts as a compressor. A little bit of Fab Filter EQ to cut out some of the muddiness, a Manly compressor to glue everything together, a UAD Dangerous EQ to make stuff a little bit brighter, and then a Slate limiter just to get things up to a proper level. I believe that's it. The only plugin I did not go over, on my string bus, I am adding a Manly, which this is a trick I learned from watching Alan Meyerson's videos. He likes to use the hardware EQ on his string bus just to make things a little bit brighter. And so it's emphasizing some of the higher frequencies in the string, and also taking out some of the muddiness, making it a little bit clearer, easier to understand. So all in all, that's my track, Prepare for Battle. I hope you guys enjoyed something. I hope you got something out of this tutorial. I'm going to start to do more of these YouTube videos, so if you guys have any ideas, suggestions, feedback for me, please feel free to get in contact. Otherwise, I hope to connect with some of you soon. Have a great rest of your day.